everybody, welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast, and welcome also to Criteria listeners, since I'll be putting this episode out on both podcast feeds. Today, I'm going to be discussing a great Catholic mid-20th century, I should say, novelist that has never really been discussed on this show, Walker Percy, and I'll be discussing his first novel, The Moviegoer, kind of a general discussion of the novel, but also specifically with attention to what that book has to say about movies, about cinephilia. And that's why I'll be putting it out on Criteria as well. So I'll be discussing the book, which I no doubt many of you have read or at least heard about, with my friend Nathan Douglas, Canadian Catholic filmmaker who and film writer, film critic who is a frequent guest on Criteria, but this will be his first time, I believe, on the Catholic Culture Podcast. So I'll introduce him in a minute. But the reason I ended up reading this book recently, actually had read it in college before, but reread it in the past month, was because I am a member of this online Great Books program, which you've heard me mention on the podcast before. And it's not actually part of the program, but there's a lot of extracurriculars that people in the program end up doing. We're all in the group Slack and talking about what else we want to read and discuss together. So there's a group of people on there who are going to be going through Walker Percy's novels in chronological order month by month. And so we just read The Moviegoer. And so as long as I'm on the topic, I'm going to be doing some more promos for OGB on here. So let me launch into that now. So Online Great Books, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is basically, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a Great Books program, a seminar program that you do via video conferencing, and it's been a great fun item conglomerate. It's been a great fun in my life. I'm sorry, I never do this with other people, but I'm so like juiced up.
You've been doing so well. I'm very proud of you.
I don't normally do this with other guests, but I feel like free to be goofy with you. So
you're doing great. You're doing great. You honestly are. So
it's really helpful to discuss these books with a group, in my experience. When it comes to philosophy, I can kind of go that on my own. My brain works that way. I can kind of engage in a dialogue with the author. But when it comes to fiction, for example, or history, I get a great deal more out of it discussing it with others. So, and then that's why this sort of great books concept has existed, is because of the kind of benefit of engaging in like a dialectic about the book rather than just reading it on your own, or rather than reading it for a class and then hearing a lecture. So it's really more about exploring the books with a group of people. They send you each book as you get to it on the list. It's designed to be doable for people who have busy lives, who have jobs and families and whatnot. It only requires, I think they say they approximate it at about 3 hours a week of reading. I think like 300 pages a month, depending on how dense the material is. So I've read, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Greek tragedies, some Platonic dialogues. I just finished reading Herodotus's History with my seminar, and we're just about to start Plato's Republic, which I have never read in my 31 years, and I'm very, very, very excited to get into that. So to give you an example of the pacing, we're taking 2 months for Plato's Republic. So we're doing 2 seminars. The seminars are once a month. So I'll probably talk more about this and highlight different aspects of the program in future promos, but I just wanted to introduce that to those who haven't heard about it. If you want to learn more about it, I would say go back to episode 27, in which I interviewed program founder Scott Hambrick. And the action item here is that if you sign up for, if you enroll or sign up for their waiting list by going to onlinegreatbooks.com and using the promo code Catholic Culture, or by using our special link in the show notes, you'll get 25% off your first 3-month subscription, and also we will get a kickback. So other than donating to us, signing up there is a way to help us keep the podcast going. All right. So now to introduce my discussion partner, as I mentioned, his name is Nathan Douglas. Welcome to the show, Nathan.
Thank you, Thomas. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So Nathan, before we get started with our discussion, maybe you can tell the people where they can find your work, both as a filmmaker and as a film writer.
So as Thomas mentioned, I am a filmmaker based in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I have several short projects under my belt as a writer and director, and I also work as a producer with other directors currently on short films. Some of my work is available online. If you live in Canada, you can watch my short film La Cartographe on CBC Gem, which is the online streaming platform for CBC. Another short film I made called Cave of Size is available in Canada and the US and perhaps elsewhere in the world on a platform called Kinoscope. It is a subscription platform, but you can also find it through my website on Vimeo. And then my first short film, Son in the Barbershop, which is a 7-minute one-take kind of drama, father-son drama, is available for free on Vimeo as well. So all these films, you can find links and things from my website, nwdouglas.com. And then also that's the practical side. On the theory side, I also am doing a lot of writing and research on aspects of film theory, and particularly trying to explore a theory of cinema and cinephilia from the kind of the great Western tradition, particularly drawing on the Aristotelian, Platonic, Thomistic tradition. And this is it's kind of a new project for me. I'm a convert to Catholicism from a Protestant background, so getting into the history of Western philosophy is actually it's a passion of mine. It's not something I come to by education, but I've just enjoyed it so much that it started to answer a lot of questions I had about the nature of cinema, the nature of filmmaking, and it's something that I think is going to be that I hope many more Catholics and Christians and even just anyone who's interested in the question of kind of what is cinema and what is it meant for, that we can all kind of explore this in the years ahead. I'm launching a Substack dedicated to writing about these topics: cinema, philosophy, maybe theology, though I think I'd like to try to keep it to cinema and philosophy, and that will be at what's called The Vocation of Cinema, and the address for that is vocationofcinema.substack.com. So it's not actually officially launched yet. There's no real writing up there yet, but that is something that we'll be launching later this summer.
Awesome. Great. Well, I'm really excited about that. I think that's really needed, and it'll be a great, print complement to our show Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, for which you are, a guest host, frequently. And definitely I consult you a lot about that. As for your films, the only one I've seen is La Cartographe, but I definitely recommend the Canadian listeners, if there are any, I would assume there are a few, to check that out on the CBC Gem. Yeah, because that's a really nice piece. And now that I know you have some other pieces available in the US, I'll have to watch them myself as well. So we kind of by good providence read this book around the same time. You had already read it without regard to doing any kind of discussion with me. So where can we start? We should probably just talk about this in general. I guess for those who don't know, Walker Percy was a mid-20th century Catholic novelist and essayist, probably best known for The Moviegoer and maybe Love in the Ruins among his novels. Yeah, an interesting character. I think I'll probably go more into his life on a future episode, because I plan to do a few episodes about Walker Percy in the next several months. So the book is about this character, Binx Bolling. He's the moviegoer of the title. He's a member of this kind of Southern aristocratic family, somebody who feels a bit overshadowed and stifled by kind of the values of his upbringing. but finds it to be a bit empty, kind of in despair. I mean, that is a big theme of the book. I know you wrote down the epigraph to this
Mhm.
book. Could you read that?
Yes, the epigraph is so it's from Soren Kierkegaard. Excuse me, Soren Kierkegaard's "Sickness unto Death," and it quotes, "The specific character of despair is precisely this: it is unaware of being despair."
He works in finance. He lives in New Orleans, I should say, and he spends his time just kind of wandering around. That's how he describes it, wandering around New Orleans, various neighborhoods and suburbs, um, and canoodling with his secretaries and going to see movies. And it's about his search for meaning in his life, his kind of existential crisis, and his movie going habits play a significant part in that. And so that's one reason I had Nathan on to discuss the book. Nathan, do you want to make any opening comments about this book?
This was my first Percy, and I was actually, I think, kind of surprised at how much it got a hold of me. I found this to be a very affecting read, even more so than its reputation is quite high. In the sort of, again, that the English speaking Catholic canon. Sometimes it's easy to come to that a work with a bit of an expectation that it won't necessarily fulfill. And I would say, just as an aside, and I hope this doesn't get me in trouble with any of the Catholic literature people out there, but on the plus side, there is a very strong conversation happening right now about what is Catholic literature, and has been for several years. I believe it was touched off by was it, Ted Joya's article.
No, Dana Joya.
Dana Joya, excuse me.
Ted's his brother.
Got it.
He's a music historian.
The famous Joya article, which asked, what is there a Catholic literature, so to speak? And it's been amazing kind of seeing the development of thought that has sprung up in that conversation. And I would say, just as an observer and someone who's enjoyed reading some of these articles that show up, that while there is a very wonderful revival in sort of Catholic literary thought right now, it does seem to be staying within very particular margins. Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, Shusaku Endo, which are all noteworthy authors, absolutely. But I think it's, once you've kind of experienced that for a while and seen a lot of the same kind of observations and arguments kind of flying around, it's easy to come to a work with certain expectation that maybe there's not much here to really explore beyond what has already been talked about. So anyway, I just offer that as a personal kind of, I was taken aback by the book, as I hope to be when I read a novel, and it has stuck with me, in a way that many novels don't. In a very kind of, it snuck up on me, is how I've described it to others when I've talked about it in the last few weeks.
One thing that we'll be discussing here is this question of, like, to what extent is Binx's movie going a part of his, what he calls the search for meaning that we've referred to, and to what extent it is part of the many things that he does to kind of like distract himself or numb himself. So I think we should probably talk about this concept of the search now and kind of explain what he means by that. Although first I want to say this book is a lot more entertaining to read, than you might expect from what we've said so far. It's and because I'm not someone who necessarily relates a great deal to the kind of existential angst of some of these mid-century Catholic fiction writers, that although I find the solution to their problems often very moving, that's something that helps me to enjoy the book. Is it's quite entertaining. It's very funny. It's very funny. I mean, there's laughs on every page of this book. Pretty much, I found myself laughing out loud quite often. So as I said, Binx is this guy who's kind of leading this he doesn't seem like he's a person who's on a search, because there's nothing really dramatic about any of the means by which he's conducting the search. Sometimes it's hard to tell uh, what the difference is between the search and what he's trying to escape, and which he calls everydayness. So early on in the book, he defines the search. He says, the search is what anyone would undertake if he were not sunk in the everydayness of his own life. To become aware of the possibility of the search is to be onto something. Not to be onto something is to be in despair. So what's interesting about Binx, though, is that when he's running away from everydayness, he is not seeking out colorful circumstances, or kind of trying to get away from, the bourgeois lifestyle or anything like that. He's actually trying to find some kind of meaning and beauty, I guess you could say, because it doesn't seem to be a sort of like an overtly philosophical search in a certain sense. He's trying to find meaning in the everyday without allowing it to become everyday. I guess you could put it this way: he wants to be this day. He wants it to be this day. He doesn't want to be every day or any day, even if it is in the realm of what we might call the mundane. And so he says the same about places. He doesn't want to be anyone in any place, anywhere. He wants to be someone somewhere. So he even talks about this experience he had hiking with friends, going hiking and kind of escaping normal circumstances. And he talks about actually, let me grab my book. He talks about this is on page 41 of my edition. He says, we were all pretty good drinkers and talkers, and we could spiel about women and poetry and Eastern religion in pretty good style. It seemed like a fine idea, sleeping in shelters or under the stars in the cool evergreens, and later hopping freights. In fact, this is what I was sure I wanted to do. But in no time at all I became depressed. The times we did have fun, like sitting around a fire or having a time with some girls, I had the feeling they were saying to me, how about this, Binx? This is really it, isn't it, boy? That they were practically looking up from their girls to say this. For some reason, I sank into a deep melancholy. What good fellows they were, I thought, and how much they deserved to be happy. If only I could make them happy. But the beauty of the smoky blue valleys, instead of giving us joy, became heartbreaking. So he kind of he rejects this this searching for meaning in like in a romantic way, in a kind of an overtly poetic, romantic, or even bohemian way. There's something that seems kind of self-conscious about it, that it's contrived, that there's something fake about it. And so he goes on, and at the end of this passage, he says, he stays home and watches TV these days. He says, not that I like TV so much, but it doesn't distract me from the wonder. That is why I can't go to the trouble they go to. It is distracting, and not for 5 minutes will I be distracted from the wonder. This is an interesting and somewhat confounding passage, because, again, Binx doesn't come off in this novel as someone who is, in his behavior, he doesn't seem like he's someone who's loath to distract himself, He seems like a pretty distracted guy for a lot of the novel. But there is a sense in which even in those distractions, he is seeking something, again, not something, some kind of outlandish experience that's going to take him away from, the normal life that he has, some kind of contempt for, but something that's going to give meaning to the what we would call the mundane. That leads into this question too. I mean, he's someone who gets hyper focused on certain details in films with the women that he's with, and there's this kind of there's almost a franticness to his seeking not to get lost in the everyday, because he doesn't have like he hasn't concluded his search. He hasn't found a deeper meaning to life. So he's trying to find like bits and pieces of it in like almost aesthetic experience. There's almost this neurosis to the way that um he kind of like you see this when he's talking about his time out with his girlfriend, these secretaries that he successively dates. And he's talking about it's a very precarious thing, this search, you know. There's a passage, I don't have it at hand, but there's a passage where he's talking about just taking a drive with this girl, and how basically like the slightest thing can turn everydayness into wonder, and wonder into everydayness. I mean, he's like saved from despair by by a car accident that they get into suddenly, and it turns things, it makes things right. There's like this weird like voodoo operating in his conception of what it means to be in despair, what it means to be onto something. And he does seem kind of like he's spinning his wheels. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. He's spinning his wheels. He seems to have this kind of dual aspect of someone who is, we could say, put in the terms of he's awake to the poetry of life, like at such a level. He's sensitive to beauty and being at such a level that the slightest contingency or the slightest turn can set him off. He seems like someone who is used to peering under the surfaces of things to find, well, to look for what, for the deeper things that he's looking for. He's sensitive to his life constantly being impacted by, almost like being itself, by other things. In a theological sense, maybe he gets there by the end of the novel, like the sense that there is an unseen being who is, touching his life at different points. Like, in classic Catholic philosophical understanding, you would see these moments of beauty and power breaking through even the negative of being saved from despair by a car wreck, as the providential hand of God at work. And the difference between him and maybe a more conventional protagonist is that he doesn't experience tragedy as tragedy, or an unexpected turn of events. He is either so numb or so awake, and it's debatable which of the two he is, that he can experience the unexpected, whether that's negative or positive, as an entirely positive phenomenon. But right. I think Percy's very clear that this is someone who's extremely disassociated from. Well, again, maybe this is part of the magic of the novel. Like he's someone who is highly self-aware, almost like dangerously so, but is so clearly checked out of his actual life and the people in his actual life, the way he treats the people in his actual life. Right. He is not actually a charitable person, and yet he is entirely aware of kind of the intricacies of the crevices of the crisis within himself. But that awareness does not translate into virtue. That's
something that I struggle with a little bit with some of these. I wouldn't say I struggle with them. I don't object to it. Some of these kind of like Catholic existentialist writers like Percy and O'Connor. I had a conversation with Joshua Wren on a previous episode where I talked about how I thought that some of these authors were kind of limited in like the range of human experience that they bring to bear, because they're focused on what seem like very distinctly and narrowly modern problems, and problems that not even all modern people suffer from in the same ways. I certainly identify with being like highly self-aware and self-analyzing to the point of madness, but not in this way where like I'm kind of unable to believe in anything, or unable to relate to like a rational argument in the way that he seems to be in certain points in the book. Um, but what I do get though, what I do get is this sense of the unreality of the kind of like tradition that he finds himself in. Because we experience this within Catholicism as well, I think. I think that we all have encountered like kind of maybe an over intellectualized version of the faith, for example, or a kind of over moralized version, which suddenly somehow doesn't seem to reach the core of what the faith is about. Something it doesn't reach to the human heart. It doesn't heal. You know, like it might be true as far as it goes, but there's something off. There's like a lack of dealing with the core problem, or or you could even say a lack of vulnerability to it, where love is not really at work. So I think that some people are able to kind of go with that and take it as far as it goes, and other people, like Binx, I think, are left completely cold by it and are unable to connect with it on the what you might call the, relatively speaking, the superficial level of philosophy, of intellectual life, of moralism. And that doesn't really excuse his selfishness, but I think that in his case, he's not even dealing with, he was baptized Catholic, but the family he spends most time around is his aunt's family, and she's just got these there's a great line, actually. Let me find this. It's late in the book when he's talking about the attitudes that his two families have towards God. And I'll just read this whole section, actually. Neither my mother's family nor my father's family understand my search. My mother's family think I have lost my faith. That's the Catholic side of the family. My mother's family think I have lost my faith, and they pray for me to recover it. I don't know what they're talking about. Other people, so I have read, are pious as children and later become skeptical. Not I. My unbelief was invincible from the beginning. I could never make head or tail of God. The proofs of God's existence may have been true for all I know, but it didn't make the slightest difference. If God himself had appeared to me, it would have changed nothing. In fact, I have only to hear the word God and a curtain comes down in my head. My father's family think that the world makes sense without God, and that anyone but an idiot knows what the good life is, and anyone but a scoundrel can lead it. The family situation I was referring to just now is what he describes as his father's family, which is mostly what we see for most of the book, because they're the ones who are in New Orleans. His deceased father's family, mainly meaning his aunt, and his uncle, who also happens to be Catholic, actually, but it doesn't really play much of a part in the book. This kind of like, yeah, well, the good values are obvious, and why can't people just get their act together, but not really dealing with kind of the deeper woundedness of human nature, just kind of like standing outside the world and saying, look at how everything's going to pot. This is his aunt's attitude. Like, well, we're fighting the long defeat, but like without the actual hope that that a Christian would have when they use that phrase. So I totally understand that, as someone who grew up in a very kind of intellectualized Catholic environment. I'm certainly, I think, better than what his aunt has to offer, but still kind of I did have to find something deeper in the faith than that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that I'd like to read the second part of his definition of the search, kind of to dovetail with that, where, and just with his aunt's family, there's this very bourgeois, well-to-do, kind of cold American. They're American success stories. They work in finance. They're well off. They have really everything they need to have a happy material life. And yet there's this coldness at the heart of them, and there's this crisis that Kate, the step cousin, is undergoing herself. And so Binx mentions in his definition of the search, when he talks about the movies, how they relate to it, he says, the movies are onto the search, but they screw it up. The search always ends in despair. They like to show a fellow coming to himself in a strange place. But what does he do? He takes up with the local librarian, sets about proving to the local children what a nice fellow he is, and settles down with a vengeance. In 2 weeks' time, he is so sunk in everydayness that he might just as well be dead.
Yeah.
So, right here, he's describing the classic Hollywood ending, in that the
Yes,
rule
that's
of
right.
classic Hollywood is always, it always has to be a happy ending. And this is something that was very, very intentionally dictated by the Hays Code and the Office of Joseph Breen. And it doesn't like play out the same every time, of course, but this is a very institutionalized rule that there must be a happy ending. And even just aside from the sort of the moral requirements of the Hays Code, uh, there's just the general, very peculiarly American nose for selling, what people want to see, and that is, of course, an unequivocally happy ending. So I guess I read in this passage, this kind of rebellion against this idea that certainly that what's portrayed as a happy ending in the movies is actually a happy ending. Like to most, I think, just even just natural accounts of like what constitutes a good life. Settling down in a community, in marriage, raising children, just becoming part of these are all natural goods. These are all
Right.
these are all through Christian life, these are all goods that become supernaturalized. And so, and yet in the context of kind of the classic American cinema, it's very easy to see it as this is just one more product, one more fantasy that is being sold for our escape.
The point is that the deeper issues are not really being addressed.
Yes.
And that's why, a lot of those films, they wouldn't put you onto the search, in the way that, Andrei Rublev, which we discussed on Criteria a while back, would. That's a movie that it does have, you could say it has a happy ending, it has a joyful ending.
Joyful ending.
But it does put you onto something. I mean, it does leave you open, or it like opens you up, and you're still open at the end of the film, if that makes sense. And so, I love good classic Hollywood movies, but and some of them do this, but it's more that they take for granted. I think they take for granted certain things that a film that Andrei Rublev doesn't. They take for granted deeper realities, and they don't make it the primary matter of the story. So that you end up having these things where, like, the basic issues and in fact, many of the basic crises that America is suffering even underneath the surface are not being dealt with. The things that are going to wash away all of the good natural values that are celebrated in these golden age of Hollywood movies. And of course, you're not necessarily going to find the solution to the problem by like sitting around gazing at your navel either, like Binx does, so that's not necessarily the solution either. In fact, the funny thing is he does find it in what you might call a more conventional life. But the point is that he's doing it for a deeper reason. I think that's where you get at the end. He's about to go to medical school, and he's about to get married, and he's finding meaning in, responsibility, but he's not just doing it in like a kind of, this is what we do and this is what people of good stock must do, or even necessarily in like a Jordan Peterson sense of like finding meaning and responsibility. Although I think there actually is a little bit of that going on, but I think it's clearly shown to be leading upward from that as well. I think it's like an entry point for him. Absolutely. Basically, okay, well, here's something I do. Maybe I am finding ways in which I do relate to this character now that I discuss it, because I do feel like I'm someone who is not able to Binx is a functional guy, not really a spiritually functional guy, but he is able to go to work and pay his bills and stuff and be outwardly respectable. I'm not able to do that. I'm someone who is not able to function without a deeper reason. I literally like cannot function on a daily, like normal, mundane human basis, without like a deeper spiritual thing going on. Um, I don't think that I wouldn't say that I don't have self-love, but I don't have the kind of self-love that enables people, or the personal strength, the wherewithal to um to just live a life without love but still function and like have a do you see what I'm getting at? I relate to that, that Binx does need a deeper reason to kind of embrace these realities of family, of responsibility, of even respectability, for which has does have some value in this world, just to be a or not respectability, but of like contributing, to be a sort of like a member of society who's looking to give something to his community. I think that I do relate to the fact that that doesn't come naturally to him, and that he sees that that's quite empty without a deeper grounding.
And then this kind of language comes up a lot in cultural commentary about, like, various crises that we're facing today, and you'll say, like, if you use one popular one in Catholic discussion is, the crisis of masculinity or something like that, where it's like, what's wrong with men? What's wrong with masculinity in the present age? And one solution is the Jordan Peterson approach of gaining more responsibility, as you mentioned. It's easy to look at that in terms of, we sort of taking like a sociological kind of, or like a clinical kind of like look at it and being like, oh, well, so-and-so just needs to fulfill this role and then they will be fully engaged in life. And, some people may try to appropriate that way of looking at it in order to game themselves or trick themselves, so to speak, into fulfilling into a role that is actually fulfilling. Whether that's committing, in a marriage, or embracing parenthood, or calling of work, or maybe pursuing religious life. Anyway, it could be any number of like intense responsibility defining decisions. But I think we're in a culture and an age right now that is so used to stepping outside and analyzing these things kind of like from the outside, instead of just like doing them.
Yes.
And I say that as someone who definitely struggles with paralysis by analysis, as one way I've heard it said. Instead of kind of just embracing the opportunities that are in front of me and really giving of myself. I know, the older I get, the more that I pray about this, the more that I think about this, the more I see like there is a really it all comes down to the desire to give, to give of oneself.
Yeah.
In marriage, in a vocation, in parenthood, in other giving contexts. And for the artist, like, I'm a filmmaker, so like as an artist, there is a deep connection to the aspect of artistic talent as a gift, and not just like a gift that you need to be responsible for to God because He gave you something beautiful, but really it's a gift that is meant to be given to others. The way that you operate those talents are going to bring life to others. And so this aspect of gift, which, kind of like permeates everything, I think Binx is, I mean, like, because it's such a profound human thing, he is definitely struggling with that, in an age which, didn't really have, at least in the Catholic world, didn't really necessarily have the like kind of the theological language to, at that point, to really discuss it the way that we do now in the post John Paul II era. I guess I see a little bit of maybe a little bit of that kind of the Pascal thing, where it's like, if you don't believe, then his advice to a non-believer is to simply mimic the actions of a believer, to begin praying, to begin praying the
but
Mass.
Not with that being like an end in itself, which is kind of like, what you could accuse Jordan Peterson of, is that like, as though that's sufficient, so I think that Binx, I agree with you. Like, I think it's better, rather than navel gazing, I think it's better to learn these things by living them, to like get that deeper meaning by living these things that can put you in touch with it, especially these days, with the the tendency towards like empty analysis. Um, but I think the point is that you are looking for something more. So the point is that you're not just looking for a conventional good life in this world. I think that the way this book concludes with Binx kind of finding a deeper meaning in a life that looks like strangely similar to what his aunt would have, recommended to him, is it kind of points to this full circle nature of Christian conversion, where it's more your interior that's transformed than kind of like your outward occupation. I think that depending on the society you live in, it might look more drastically different from your fellow pagans than not. But this also is something that I see as an artist, because I think that like there's been this idea that artists have to kind of look different and act different and talk different and like wear different clothes, than everybody else, and be bohemians and like be part of a scene. But like actually the artist should be like 11, right, to his community. And sure, that might partially take the form of being a little eccentric, or just having a distinct like kind of art. The point is that artists can't help but be different, and that's true of Christians too. You can't help but be different, so you don't need to like affect this kind of like artistic way of I think that a real artist should like view it as a faux pas to be an artist in public, in a certain sense. You know what I mean? Like because being an artist means making art ultimately.
Yes.
Artists are different from others. They do think differently in general, not just when they're working, but I think you should be able to hide in plain sight. And I think that's true of Christians. You should be able to be all things to all men. You should be able to talk to people who aren't artists and relate to them. And you shouldn't need to be constantly signaling that you are different from everybody else. And I think that like that's something that Binx is like. I think that's something that Binx is quite wise and perceptive in avoiding the kind of like bohemian lifestyle of his friends that he had tried out for a minute. I think there's something. I think there's really something to that, because you can get trapped in that. And I've met people who have been living that life for decades, and like it's like, dude, you're boring. So let's talk a little bit more about this search. He talks about this vertical search. This responds to this kind of relates to that romanticism concept too. So he had previously tried the search in a different way. When he was trying it through kind of intellectual work, reading and studying, he did a stint as a research scientist. This is something that people keep telling him he should be. For some reason, everybody thinks he seems like he should be a research scientist. But he talks about how he was reading and studying these books, and it didn't really matter where he was. He was in anywhere. It didn't matter who was in his apartment or in a lab or in this city or that city. And he gets kind of freaked out by the idea that like it doesn't really matter where you are when you're doing something like this, that he feels like it's detaching him from reality in a way. I guess it's a perfectly legitimate way of seeking truth, but for him, I mean that's my comment, but for him, it's not his way. He needs a way that's going to connect him to the concrete circumstances in which he lives. He says, as a result of this vertical search through science, through philosophy, he says, the only difficulty was that though the universe had been disposed of, I myself was left over. So kind of trying to figure things out through intellectual inquiry kind of left him without a real sense of his own identity in his concrete circumstances. So then he follows that up with this little entry that he makes in his notebook. He says, explore connection between romanticism and scientific objectivity. Does a scientifically minded person become a romantic because he has a leftover from his own science? I think that's kind of interesting, and it touches on something that we observe in the kind of like uh we're all stardust, we're all made of stardust, that whole thing where it's like this kind of like
Meat machines.
reason and like meaning and like emotion and imagination and mysticism are all kind of like fragmented in their own different areas and don't have anything to do with each other in this kind of like scientific materialist worldview, because you can't make sense of everything just through scientific analysis. So you end up like saying the most inane stuff like we're made of stardust as though that like means anything.
I think this ties in actually quite closely to, again, the title of the book and the practice of movie going. One of the things that he highlights about his habit of movie going is the way in which certain moments that he sees in films are what become kind of key memories for him. And I think this ties into what you're saying about this sort of lack of mysticism in a scientific or in a materialist positivist universe. That the spiritual aspect is just completely absent, and yet going to this the cinema, which is this technological innovation, it's this victory of science over art in a certain way. If you consider that the whole kind of history of Western art from the Renaissance up until the invention of the photograph was very concerned with mimicking what the human eye sees, 3D space, perspective. And painting gets more and more and more detailed through the subsequent eras until finally we get to the invention of the photograph. And now we have a way to perfectly mimic nature without the error of the human hand or without having to be mediated through a fallible human mind. Now we have this sort of perfect mechanical reproduction aspect. There's a certain victory of science there over like in mastering nature. And then with cinema, that kind of is even more the case, because now time is being mastered as well as being captured, not just image, not just space. And so someone going to the cinema is going to engage with this, like they are experiencing this technological material innovation that is still somehow capturing a sense of mystery in certain moments, or maybe if the film isn't intentionally trying to convey a sense of mystery or mysticism or spirituality, the viewer is still somehow experiencing moments that are what we would have to just describe as beyond, that these things kind of bubble up. And Binx, references this when he says, "The fact is I am quite happy in a movie, even a bad movie. Other people, so I have read, treasure memorable moments in their lives. The time one climbed the Parthenon at sunrise. The summer night one met a lonely girl in Central Park and achieved with her a sweet and natural relationship, as they say in books. I too once met a girl in Central Park, but it is not to remember. What I remember is the time John Wayne killed 3 men with a carbine as he was falling to the dusty street in Stagecoach, and the time the kitten found Orson Welles in the doorway in The Third Man." And so there's this aspect of individual moments. He's not talking about the power of a film as a complete object, which earlier we were talking about the happy ending aspect and how like he sees in the movies the happy ending, the Hollywood happy ending. The man settles down, gets married, settles in the community, the end. He sees that as actually the beginning of despair, because 2 weeks after that ending is over, this guy has just sunk in, his life of meaninglessness. But so Binx is not talking about film as a whole poetic object, something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. He's affected by the wholeness, the integrity of it as a work of art. He's talking about individual moments. And the way that he talks about this is actually very similar to what some scholars of cinephilia have described as kind of this key aspect of cinephilia, which is involves a search of its own to kind of to collect moments of revelation. This is something that you see in the French writers, you see in cinephiles in America and the UK and beyond. It seems to be a quality of cinephilia as a whole if you talk to anybody who's passionate about movies and identifies as a cinephile, they will surely have a certain moment or several moments that kind of electrified them, even if the rest
Yeah.
of the film itself was
Right.
nothing to write home about.
Right. Right.
And so I think there's something there with he's capturing this peculiarly modern relationship with being, with existence, where we are not able to really relate to the wholeness of being, relate to the wholeness of things and their fullness, but we kind of need these like it takes like this artificial imitation of life, the cinema, to bring us back into contact, or to bring Binx back into contact with some glancing moment of mystery. And he doesn't go on to explain why John Wayne shooting three men with a carbine is meaningful. And I think that that's an important kind of aspect, again, of cinephilia, is that when someone is struck by a moment in a film, you can't necessarily, you can't explain it. If you can explain it, if you can find a reason for why it was compelling, that it's probably not really a cinephilic moment in the sense that we're talking about there. But these glancing moments, these contingent moments that are things that are not. It's what the scholar Paul Villemin, who's a British film theorist, describes as basically these. For the cinephile, there's a moment in a film when cinema, in showing you one thing, allows you to glimpse something else that you are not meant to see. And so what he's describing there is this effect of being in the film, watching a film that has a certain goal in mind. It's trying to tell you a story or make you cry or whatever. The filmmaker has a certain goal in mind, and it might be even be a very crass, like commercialized goal. And yet some moment happens that was not intended by the filmmaker. It's something that is beyond this consumer artist relationship. And and if you experience a moment like that enough in your life, then that is really essentially what becomes the path of the cinephile, where you are going to the movies in order to find these moments, in order to experience films as films for what they can uniquely give to you, which is these contacts with what we would maybe describe as contacts with ultimate being, with God, but obviously not everyone would see it in that way or have the vocabulary for that.
I do think it's kind of open to question whether the fact that these are the notable moments that Binx remembers, does that mean that these moments in films are connecting him to reality, or does it mean that films are making the rest of making actual reality like dull to us? You know what I mean? There's a danger in that too, if you're going to talk about like escapism, in seeking like sensational moments. Now, not every one of those moments, he might be, I haven't seen The Third Man, but maybe that moment with the kitten is not a dramatic high point of the film. But the shot of John Wayne with his rifle, that's a larger than life moment, and that's the sort of thing that could leave someone wanting more in their own life and unsatisfied with finding meaning and beauty in their Satan life, perhaps.
I think they are a sign of him experiencing something transcendent. Yeah, I don't read it as like he's so pathetic that these are what he has to handle with memories. I think what he's saying is, I think he's treating it as a sign that he is, again, so kind of sensitive to the deeper things that he's able to find them even in a bad movie. Like he's so, even in the middle of like an experience that would be in the traditional way of watching a movie as a work of entertainment, if you don't feel like you got your money's worth, then you feel like, oh, that was a waste of time, and he's saying even during the waste of time, even during a bad movie, I am rich. I am receiving these things, these moments that become memories. And that's then what, scholars of cinephilia like Paul Villemin would go on to dissect that and describe it as contacts with something that is in excess of what is being shown.
There's also, this going back to this kind of need to be somewhere and not anywhere. There's also this thing that he does when he goes to movies, which is he needs to know something about the theater. He needs to talk to the person, operating the projector, or the theater owner, or somebody in a seat next to him. Something he wants to know something about the neighborhood. That's kind of interesting too, because it does show that even though he's someone who kind of loses himself in movies a lot, he is kind of aware of the kind of like homogenizing potential of this art form. I mean, if you think about it, like yeah, I guess you could say this about books, but other than books, no art form has had this quality before modern times of like recorded music or cinema, where like it is exactly the same product no matter where you are. It's not a live performance. It's not a painting that you're seeing that only one, of each copy exists. I mean, especially when you get into the digital era, like it is exactly the same thing, right? There's not even like a different reel,
Yeah.
that you're dealing with. It is an exact copy.
No scratches.
So it's interesting that he's attuned to this danger of kind of like just like being detached from your concrete surroundings by technology. And that's like a very like prescient aspect of the book, I think.
Even though he's taking in this product that, yeah, is supposed to be the same from theater to theater, and he talks about he has this habit of, he goes from different theaters. He doesn't popularize just one theater. He's kind of like collecting theaters as part of his search. But then also that he goes to the trouble of talking to the theater owner, as you mentioned. Listen, and as he says, listen to him tell his troubles. There's that implication of the local aspect, this idea that the going to the cinema is a local thing that's part of your local community. Like each neighborhood traditionally has its own theater. And then when times change and business is being taken elsewhere, what are some of the first things to go? The local neighborhood theater. You see this in changing urbanization, across especially North America, where everything moves into the conglomerate Cineplex model, and the one screen, maybe two screen neighborhood theater is left behind. And so the personal aspect, the idea that simply going to the movies is not just a relationship with a corporate product that's delivered to you in pristine quality, but really it's this part of a relationship with your community. It's again is integral to this kind of community as like a barbershop or a local grocer, where it's like it's run by a particular person who has a particular life and they're providing this service. But I know this person. I get to engage and talk to this person as a person. Seeing a movie in their theater is not the same thing as seeing a movie in any other theater. Now he doesn't really go into this in the book, but I think he is definitely touching on these tensions of the uniqueness of pre-digital life, the sheer uniqueness of the pre-mass culture life, even though this is still very much within the realm of mass culture. That's all going away by the time you get to where we are now.
It's like pre-sexual revolution. It's pre kind of like late 60s cultural foment, but you can see a lot of that going on in this book. You can see a lot of that kind of under the surface changes that are happening. This moviegoing, this like specificity of a film experience under certain circumstances is also related to the character of Lonnie, his younger half brother, who is the most Catholic member of his mother's. His father had died, his mother remarried and started a big Catholic family, and Lonnie is the most devout of them, and he has some kind of condition. I don't know if it's supposed to be like cystic fibrosis or like muscular dystrophy or
something like that.
He's in a wheelchair, and he offers his sufferings in reparation for the indifference of men to the pierced heart of Jesus Christ, I think is how Binx puts it. Um, and Lonnie too is a moviegoer and goes with Binx, and they share these moments. You know, we were talking about heightened moments. They share a special awareness of those things, which is you know, not maybe a pleasure that is proper to the art of film, but it is proper to the experience, like the enjoyment of film. I think it's something that is like probably at the core of like film criticism and writing about film, you know, is that like either you share a look or you use the elbow, as one of the film writers you sent me
Yes.
quotes by mentioned, as like, you know, the lucky few who really understand each other or really are on the same wavelength in watching a movie. They don't have to elbow the person in the ribs to point out that there's a special moment happening. They can simply look at each other or not. Maybe they don't even need to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I just want to read this passage because for me, this was the most affecting moment in the book, where he's describing being at the movies with Lonnie and with his secretary, Sharon, who he's harassing or courting, depending on how you want to look at that.
Right.
Uh, Basically, or he's taking his secretary to meet his family. And so they go to the movies together, and he writes about Lonnie. He looks around at me with the liveliest sense of the secret between us. The secret is that Sharon is not and never will be onto the little touches we see in the movie, and in the seeing, know that the other sees. And yeah, so this is, as you put it, like this is there's a profound experience going on here, a profound kind of communion, or at least some sort of connection that is beyond words. And for two people, you know, to experience this without having to say anything about it, without having to signal anything about it, all it takes is a look, um, is a beautiful thing. And I would say that this is something that, yeah, I think that cinephilia as a kind of as a practice at its heart is longing for. In that, you know, cinephilia tends to result in efforts to speak about a loved object, about film. It involves, like, it's not something that's just kept inside. It's meant to be. It has to somehow has to always find a way out in order to connect with others. That may not be the primary goal, but it's just it's kind of hard to decide to describe, you know, what the purpose of writing about a film is for. But there is this searching for connection, um, but to connect with somebody without even having to communicate through language, is, I mean, I would say that that is really, I think that is the goal of, um, like, all relationships, in a sense, where, you
Right.
know, who doesn't want to have that kind of intimacy with somebody.
Right.
And it's interesting that here cinema, you know, is identified as kind of a way to mediate that, um,
Hmm.
and to actually make it possible between two people who are otherwise, well, actually, even just given the state of Lonnie's condition, is unable to really communicate with the ease and the facility that anyone else is because of the nature of his paralysis. Um, there's something profoundly freeing about the ability to simply share a moment through looking, without
Yeah.
words.
You talked about this intimacy between him and Lonnie, and this plays out in a number of ways. He almost seems to have the most intimate relationship with him of anybody else in the book. There's a this book kind of like, you know, this is not like an overly emotional book, I would say, on the whole. There's some very moving parts towards the end, and especially the parts with Lonnie are quite touching. But you know, it's kind of wry, it's dry. It's kind of, he's, as you said, he's kind of dissociated from his surroundings. The character, he don't read this book, but he also reminded me of the narrator in Lolita a little bit, in his kind of like uh his weird, like, I don't know how to describe it. Definitely the way he looks at women, but or his secretaries, but he has this kind of like detached, like, rhapsodizing that he does that's like weirdly detached from reality.
Mhm.
I don't know how else to put it, but anyway,
Idealistic.
there's this, he kind of sneaks up on you with some very moving parts, and this one particular really moved me to tears. Um, he's having this whole conversation with Lonnie, and even though Binx is not religious and Lonnie is very open with him talking about religion, and Binx is able to kind of roll with it. Um, but So Lonnie has this condition which gives him very monotonous speech. He says, Lonnie's monotonous speech gives him an advantage, the same advantage foreigners have. His words are not worn out. It is like a code tapped through a wall. Sometimes he asks me straight out, do you love me? And it is possible to tap back, yes, I love you. It's just such a beautiful passage. It really comes out of nowhere. And especially with Binx being this really detached character and somebody who doesn't have much love in his life, it's all the more moving for that. There's another passage I wanted to bring up about movies. Well, no, not about movies, but I think it kind of bears on this, and maybe can lead us into a little bit more of a discussion of what you get from this book about cinephilia, which is, unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me, but there is a passage where he talks about how he used to seek beauty, uh, but that, like, it basically only just made him more miserable, which is interesting. He says beauty is a whore. He used to seek meaning in beauty, but that's kind of interesting. It indicates that he's not seeking beauty in film, or at least to what extent, to whatever extent he's seeking it, it's in a somewhat like defanged way. It's not the beauty that can like make him fully aware of like the meaninglessness of his life, you know, if that makes sense. It's not a beauty that can like wound him too much. It's kind of like mediated through this conventional Hollywood structure, is the way that I would put it. You know what I mean? Like, there are these moments, these really amazing moments, but it's kind of mediated in a safe form of this like Hollywood golden age kind of formula. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, and this kind of gets at something that again I've been referencing the scholar Paul Velleman quite a bit. The reason I do that is because he wrote a really fascinating essay on cinephilia in the 1990s called "Through the Glass Darkly: Cinephilia Reconsidered." He talks about how the reason that cinephilia kind of came out to be associated with, especially watching these highly commercialized Hollywood films. One of the points he makes is that because these films are products of a very rigorous, like, because these are they're highly coded, highly ritualized products, moments that stand out to the cinephile, these contacts with ultimate reality that come as a surprise, these moments that are what he describes as in excess of what is being shown.
Hmm.
These are actually you're more likely to find these moments in films that are highly commercialized, that are highly meant to be a digestible, disposable product, or maybe simplistic, because partly because the aspect of it's just surprising, you know, to find something that might have contact with reality is something that is so artificial, but also
Hmm.
in that works of art, particularly films that are highly coded, highly ritualized, you know, is very much kind of you're getting the same thing again and again. That allows the moments of true breakthrough to actually stand out in a way that they wouldn't necessarily in a like an art film, for example, that is was really designed to be a profound, deep experience. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely many art house films, so to speak, or art films that are deeply profound and moving and designed to be so. But the whole kind of nature of cinephilia is that it's finding beauty and being where it's not really supposed to be. Uh, and that's part of the treasure hunt of it. That's kind of what makes it actually an addicting. Um, Not that people think about this like literally in these terms of like, oh, okay, I'm going to go look for this now. But I think this is really what is this is what Paul Villemin and others have kind of described as this is what is kind of at the heart of what is driving the cinephile. In Christian philosophical terms, we would say that yeah, like this is absolutely one more contact with the ultimate grounded being who is God, coming through, something as throwaway as a Hollywood movie from 1945. That's just how much his being permeates, all, and is the foundation of all being. So like not even something as unimportant as this can be a conduit for experiencing a moment with him. Yeah, I think this is the underlying. This really is, as far as like cinephilia, and we could say the movie going. I would say that this is what's underlying the ultimate search, at least as far as how he looks for things in movies. One thing I find really fascinating about this is that this book was written in 1960, or was published in 1960, and that comes at the very end of a decade, the 1950s, which already saw profoundly important developments in what we would call cinephilia in France. And so just as a very, very compact overview, cinephilia, as a term kind of became popularized in the French context, especially after World War II. There was an influx of American films that, really became available to Parisians, people in Paris in particular. And there grew up this culture, a film culture around this, film clubs, publications, columns and newspapers. Like there was just this revitalization of film culture after the war, and deeply at the center of this film culture was the hundreds of theaters in Paris that young people in particular would go to night after night, and it was kind of a major for these early cinephiles. It was their main passion. Now that ended up having certain effects through the rest of film culture, both in France and the rest of the world. One that viewers and listeners may be familiar with is what we would call the French New Wave, which was an independent filmmaking movement that came out of the ideas of many writers and critics who were part of this post-war wave of cinephilia in France. They went on to make their own films. And then that itself had a very powerful effect on how films were made in English-speaking cultures and beyond. Percy talks about moviegoing, which it's hard to describe necessarily as cinephilia in the sense that we would describe the French phenomenon I just described, that post-war film culture. We know that as cinephilia, as the love of cinema. That was kind of a term that kind of grew up with it. In the US, in particular, you kind of have this much more entertainment kind of minded focus. It's kind of more of a commodity, a product. It's an exchange of value where, you go to escape. And so it's not so much about the love of the cinema. And, the French cinephiles were very much approaching films as something that could teach them about life. They were kind of living their lives through cinema. Not in an escapist sense of trying to escape their day-to-day lives, but in a way that it was kind of educating them in beauty, philosophy, and not explicitly educating. These are things they were kind of drawing from their experience, but they were kind of, I would describe it as they were captured by the beauty of certain moments, the beauty of certain films, and then they had a way of articulating that to themselves so that they could actually draw a greater meaning out of it. Whereas in the US, you kind of have more of a tendency in kind of it being a more Protestant culture, well, not just more, but a Protestant culture, you kind of have more of a focus on meaning in the sense of things have to have a very clear meaning or moral. There's this highly coded, highly ritualized way of making films, which is like you are always going to get the same product every time. You're always going to feel happy. And it's less about kind of stepping into the unknown and letting yourself be surprised by beauty, but more that you are in a relationship, in what's fundamentally an economic relationship, where you are going to get something that you expect to get. And it's this aspect, the aspect of the unexpected is kind of at the heart of cinephilia. The cinephile is someone who has learned to go into a film without expectations, but to go in with a certain hope. What they hope is to experience contact with beauty, with ultimate reality in some way. But the person who is still in the kind of economic consumer mindset, they go in not with hope, but with expectation, which is that I want to be entertained, I want to escape. And I think Binx is kind of in between these two things, in that his pursuit of cinema is not fully cinephilic in the way that the French may be, where they actually see it as a way of living life, and that it kind of informs everything else. I think it's kind of partly, there's an aspect of escapism here in that classic kind of American, like, take me somewhere else. I want to not be in my life. I want to be somewhere else. Tell me a story. And nothing wrong with that. Of course, stories are great. But also, he's not engaging with cinema strictly in this kind of economic relationship, because he goes out of his way to say, I have good times even in bad films, and he'll just go see what's playing at the local theater.
Right.
He's kind of, it's not about getting his money's worth, so to speak, as it would be for maybe the majority of audiences, or
Right.
getting his time's worth. This aspect of the investment is kind of missing for him. He's perfectly happy to just kind of waste his time, so to speak. And sometimes he'll come away with enriched with moments, with these moments that become part of his memory, that he carries, as his own memories. So I think I find the book interesting, and this is kind of a very niche take, but I just find it interesting as kind of this. It comes right at a moment before cinephilia in the French mode crossed the Channel and the Atlantic into Britain and the US, and eventually began to affect, to completely permeate film culture, particularly in places like New York, San Francisco, the centers of Chicago, of cinephile activity in the United States. The French model really became the model of cinephilia going forward. But this posits a kind of American cinephilia that's kind of already in metamorphosis, but it's not quite there yet. But it's also kind of finding its way towards some of the same aspects that became defined as like the classic kind of French search in cinephilia, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Let's talk about Kate a little bit. We haven't talked too much about his Binx's step cousin, Kate. So she's not his cousin by blood. She's his aunt's adopted daughter, and basically, I mean, he kind of finds his way out of what he calls his malaise, his kind of meaningless stupor, through Kate. He takes her on this spontaneous trip to Chicago, and at a certain point they decide to get married, and it's really his love and concern for her. I think that Binx's relationship with Kate is similar to his relationship with Lonnie, in that they both connect with him in a way that they don't with others necessarily. I think Lonnie is just generally more open, probably, but Kate is pretty clearly not that way with her parents. And with others, she's kind of alienated from them, and their expectations for her. But it's that Binx doesn't really treat them differently. He kind of treats them as though they're normal, or he doesn't judge them. He doesn't act like they're being weird. When Lonnie talks to him about religion and his spiritual struggles, and when Kate just acts strange and
Erratic.
disturbed as she is. Kate's been through a trauma. She lost her fiance in a car accident that she too was in years back, and is kind of lost in life. She's 25 years old. I think Binx is 29 for most of the novel, and turns 30 towards the end. And we don't know exactly what's wrong with her. I think she probably had problems before, this car accident. But as you say, you could interpret it as depression, but she also goes through kind of like brief, I don't know if you could call it manic phases, where she kind
Kind
of
of,
feels like
yeah.
she has it all figured out
Mhm.
suddenly, and now she's going to be happy and she knows what to do, and then she immediately sinks back down into a worse depression than before. Um, Kate's love and compassion for her, I think, and his acceptance of her, um, end up being his way out uh, of his own spiritual problems. So they go on this trip, they come back, they decide to get married. And one of the reasons for that is that Kate decides that she needs somebody to tell her what to do, um, which is really interesting and kind of takes you a while to get used to it. Uh, she has a lack of direction in life, and she feels unmoored from others, from relationships, from just meaning. And she has this whole passage where so Kate says, "Will you tell me what to do?" "Sure. You can do it because you are not religious. God is not religious. You are the unmoved mover. You don't need God or anyone else. No credit to you unless it's a credit to be the most self-centered person alive. I don't know whether I love you, but I believe in you and I will do what you tell me. Now, if I marry you, will you tell me, Kate, this morning do such and such? And if we have to go to a party, will you tell me, Kate, stand right here and have 3 drinks and talk to so and so? Will you?" Clearly, she's searching for stability, basically. And she sees Binx as stable. I think she wants to be told what to do in a way that is for her, in a sense, because she's being told. It's not that there's a lack of people telling her what to do in her life. She gets plenty of
Mhm.
her aunt telling her what to do. Um, but and she has a therapist who probably tells her what to do. But I think that these people are kind of imposing their own expectations on her in a way that Binx doesn't. And I think that's why she is looking for Binx to tell her what to do, kind of paradoxically, maybe. Um,
Mhm.
but I think that what's interesting about it is the way that this affects Binx, and he does it for her sake. But it seems to be this relationship with her in which he tells her what to do, which prompts his uh, finding meaning, and prompts, I think, implicitly at the end of the book, his being involved with religion again, being involved with his Catholic faith. It's not really said in a very detailed or explicit way, but I think it's made pretty clear by implication. Um,
Mhm.
and so it's interesting to me, and maybe I'm reading into it somewhat, but Walker Percy as a Catholic, I can see him seeing it this way, which is that um, in accepting this responsibility of a certain kind of authority over his soon-to-be wife and wife, they, by the end of the book, they do get married. This sort of like order is established, and I think that it prompts Binx to like find himself in his rightful place in that order on both sides. So he's not somebody who would have, of his own accord, decided, I'm going to get married and I'm going to tell my wife what to do, you know?
Mhm.
But Kate asks him to do this for her. And so in accepting that position of authority, I think that he's also prompted, and it perhaps becomes more natural for him and more meaningful for him to find some ground. I mean, she sees him as stable because of his unique weirdness, I guess, but he finds the need to find that groundedness and that stability in something higher than himself as well. That's kind of how I take uh what conversion may be affected by the end of the book. I think that's a large part of it. I think Lonnie, of course, plays a part as well. But
Mhm.
most of the book is him kind of stagnating, Um, and this search is not really moving in any particular direction. So that's all I can see. That's one of the big reasons I can see for what changes by the end. What do you think, that there's anything to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to just to talk about that. I want to just back up a little bit to the train ride, which is such a kind of powerful kind of coming together of everything, and particularly the fact that they actually consummate their relationship as lovers on the train ride
To
uh,
Chicago.
to Chicago, and that in a conventional like 20th century romance, or maybe one that maybe would come after the sexual revolution, that would of course be the climax of a rom-com or something like that, where it's
Hmm.
like they finally found each other. They found this is the moment when everything comes together. They have their ultimate meaning and happiness. Um, and it's interesting that obviously Percy isn't doing that here. But one thing I found very striking about that was how he describes, such an encounter that is, for literature would be fraught with, landmines as far as how to properly describe this in a way that the full weight of it is impressed upon the reader without being lascivious. And I think he actually does that more successfully than any other reader or writer
Hmm.
I've read, actually, in that the
Yeah.
full spiritual desolation that they are going through and that they are seeking to overcome, and just simply making worse by having an illicit sexual relationship is like, I don't know. I'm just struck by how powerfully he kind of captures all that in a way that is impossible to really like describe, because it's kind of just the art of how he tells it
Right.
is impossible to really translate. But I highlight that as an example of, so the thing is that the consummation of the relationship in a romantic sense is not the end of their story. It's not even the climax of their story. It's not even the proper place of meaning for their story as it would be for many other writers. And it's not even
Nor is it very
actually,
romantic.
nor is it very romantic. It's actually it's extremely upset. It's quite sad. It's this very like sorrowful thing. But then the marriage itself, as well as maybe, as the sort of the happy ending or whatever uh, uh, that many stories would strive for, is not really the happy ending of this book, even though like they enter into what seems to be a loving marriage. What I'm trying to describe is that Percy is not parking us on these conventional climaxes that would be the case in so many other kind of versions of this story. The
Hmm.
climax that he chooses goes exactly into this intimacy that Kate initiates with Binx, in terms of like, in philosophical terms, really, where she's like in theological and philosophical terms, where she's like, I want you to tell me what to do. And at the very end of the book, and this is the other part that moved me so greatly, is
Yeah.
this episode where, or sorry, this the very last exchange between them, is he asks her to go downtown to run an errand for him. He's taking care of his younger siblings. And so she is nervous about it. She doesn't want to be out of his presence. Uh, but he convinces her to take the streetcar downtown, do this, and then go home, and I'll meet you there. And she says, "But will you be thinking about me while I'm doing this?" And he says, "Yes, I will be thinking about you the whole time." And she gets very precise about it, and she goes to the steps again, like, and you can clearly see on one level, like, this is someone who is dealing with mental health burdens, who is, very anxious about simply performing a basic functional task.
Right.
And but what's really going on here is this existential anxiety of, do you love me so much that while I'm out of your sight, you will be thinking of me? And even at this mundane moment of being on this streetcar in this seat, will you be thinking of me? And if I know that you are, then that is what will get me through this simple task. Um, I I guess I just find um, Kate's whole relationship to Banks, and like the trust that she is kind of placing in him, and yeah, I think so. I think that's essentially what you're saying, where the amount of trust and so to speak faith that she's placing in him, um, kind of as almost the reason for her being, like, she can't even do this thing without knowing that he is thinking about her, um, is I think that is the site. Yeah, I think that is the site of his own conversion, and his own relationship to God, who, we would not exist without him thinking of us at all times. Um,
Yeah.
and I guess I would hesitate. Like, I'm not. when I'm reading a novel, honestly, I'm not out to try to read the symbolic the symbolic sense is not the one that I try to go for at first, but it is unavoidable here, and it is genuinely beautiful here. I think in that um, like Percy's way of symbolizing the relationship of humans to God and of being part of God's being, of being always in His thought, always we are always more. He's always more present to us than we are to ourselves, and I think that's Saint Augustine's way of putting it. Um, is he's totally capturing that, and this is the destination kind of which the whole search has led to, but it's I mean, kind of similar to finding it in these moments, that he finds in the movies. It comes to him in this one particular moment that's just simply, hey, can you do this errand? Like, I guess it's kind of everything coming together with the full weight of existential meaning through the mundane moment,
Right.
so to speak. So.
Do you have a favorite humorous passage from this book?
I do. I don't know if I want to share it because it's so juvenile that I actually don't remember what but it's when he's talking about speaking to a relative on the steps of the library, and he's holding in like flatulence, and I laughed out loud. I was reading this late at night, falling asleep, and I actually like laughed out loud and wondered what my next door neighbor might have thought. But I can't. Do you want me to find the passage or?
No, it's okay. You don't need to read it.
Okay. It's just it's such a dry. It was so very dry. It took me completely by surprise. So.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. And what I really like about the writing style of this book is its indirectness sometimes. On like page 3 of this book, he's describing about going to a movie with one of his previous girlfriends / secretaries, Linda. And, talks about their relationship and how, the things that made him happy made her unhappy, and, vice versa. And then he goes, but all this is history. Linda and I have parted company. I have a new secretary, a girl named Sharon Kincaid. And it's such an interesting turn because at that point you don't know that this is his secretary. Like you don't know that he makes a habit of dating his secretaries. So he's just mentioned Linda as this girl that he went out with, but he's never mentioned that that's his MO. So it's a really interesting way of introducing it, where it just comes out of nowhere. Linda and I have parted company. I have a new secretary. It's like, wait, so he's been dating his secretaries. And there's also a nice indirect way of revealing his kind of re-involvement with his religion into which he was baptized. He says, as for my search, I have not the inclination to say much on the subject. For one thing, I have not the authority, as the great Danish philosopher declared, to speak of such matters in any way other than the edifying. For another thing, it is not open to me even to be edifying, since the time is later than his, much too late to edify or do much of anything except plant a foot in the right place as the opportunity presents itself, if indeed ass-kicking is properly distinguished from edification. And then he goes, further, I'm a member of my mother's family, after all, and so naturally shy away from the subject of religion, which is really, again, this indirect, surprising way of him telling you, oh, okay, so my search actually is now involved in religion, which is something that he's previously said that he is indifferent to, and he has mentioned multiple times that they're not comfortable talking about his mother's family, even though they're all Catholic. Other than Lonnie, they're not really comfortable talking seriously about their faith. So the way that he just at the last second, in this very like Columbo like manner, introduces this without really harping on it is quite interesting. It's an interesting style. Well, I think we better wrap up here. Nathan, this was fun. I'm glad we got to do this. And can you remind people where they can find your writing?
Yeah, you can find information on all my work through my website, nwdouglas.com, and writing in particular will be at vocationofcinema.substack.com. And like I said before, that will be launching this summer.
Yeah, and if people want to hear Nathan and I and our co-host James Majewski talking about some specific films, especially Catholic films, you can check out Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, our other show, and Nathan's a frequent guest host on there, and will be on there again before too much longer. All right, so thanks everybody for listening, and I'll see you next time.